Humanity is amazing at missing the point. God tells Moses and the people to love one another as they love themselves. Moses and the people come back to God with, okay, yeah, so we're not really sure what that means. It's just so big of an ask. We don't even know where to start. I mean, we're lucky if we do actually love ourselves. How do you expect us to love one another? And I mean, do you really expect us to be able to truly love one another? I mean, even that jerk who breaks into people's homes when they're out working, or that guy who keeps asking for a free meal while he drowns his life away at the bottom of a jug. God says, look, stop murdering one another. Stop cheating on your spouses. Stop abandoning your wives and children. And stop lying. And if you are going to lie, at least keep my name out of your mouth. And people turn around and go, okay, cool. So beating someone half to death is okay. One night stands are all good. As long as we legally divorce our wives, we're fine. And as long as we tell the truth when we swear by God's name, no problems. And Moses and his successors go, okay, fine. Here, have several hundred rules to follow. I mean, they aren't perfect, but at least they will start you down the right path. And for a time, that worked. Not great, but there were certainly abuse and violence and even war among the people. But there were also people who lived their lives in righteousness and justice. Though over time, the numbers became smaller and smaller, and the stratification between the haves and the have-nots grew greater and greater. Then came the Babylonians and the exile, and the people, and especially the leaders of the people, repented and started following the rules, at least for a time. Now, I think we can all understand this. When you're sharing in one another's suffering and can see one another's children becoming ill and dying from malnutrition, it is easier to have compassion and to care for one another. One of the things we saw with the COVID is at first, we were all united in our common struggle. Everyone around the world shared a common fear. People were becoming sick overnight and dying. It was terrifying. And in that moment, there was a sense of everyone, regardless of race or creed or nationality or social status, coming together to fight this common enemy. But as the days stretched into weeks and then months, we became isolated from one another and turned against one another in new ways. We became splintered and cut off from one another's realities. And so, in the same way, when they returned from the exile and stratification of society reasserted itself, the ability of God's people to share in one another's suffering diminished with it. And their propensity to love one another also declined. Those with power, prestige, and wealth stopped being able to understand the suffering of others. It was not their lived reality. So it must be either in the imagination of those experiencing it or God's punishment upon them. They deserved it. If they were worthy, then God would have blessed them with the good life. So God sent more prophets to try to remind the people to love one another. I mean, not even love for all of humanity. Just love the people you are living amongst, your fellow Jews. Have compassion within your own community. Start small. Again, stop murdering one another. Don't leave your wife and children to starve in the streets, and stop using God's name to back up your own falsehoods. And so the people were once again challenged to follow these rules. Do this, don't do that. And it'll be like you are loving one another. And hey, if you practice a habit long enough, it becomes part of who you are. So maybe in the end, you will sort of love one another. But in our gospel today, Jesus, following in the footsteps of Moses, the prophet, and the Pharisees, says, wait, hold up. Point is not to follow just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. Point is to actually love one another, not to barely tolerate one another, to care and have compassion for one another, not to just put up with one another and choose not to hurt somebody today. The point is not to have to choose not to do evil to one another, but rather to so train one's heart on God that evil is not even thought about. To become filled with God's love, to become servants to one another. But look, I know this is not an easy ask, and the early Christians certainly fell short. I mean, look at 1 Corinthians. Even though the scriptures are not chosen to align in this way, Paul is nonetheless dealing with the same issue. God's chosen people, the people grafted onto the stem of Jesse, are behaving just like those people that Jesus and Moses confronted. They are consumed by human inclinations to vie for power and prestige, to be superior, to see one another as competition rather than as part of oneself. But as with Jesus, Paul reminds us to love, to take one another's burdens as our own, to have compassion on one another, and to rejoice in one another's strengths and talents, to build one another up rather than to tear one another down, to love one another as oneself. Amen.